Hello everyone, in this video we're going to cover pages 11 and 12 of the GCSE biology notes on genetics and also the double award biology notes on genetics as well. So if you get your booklet open at that page, we're going to look at a disease which is more common in Northern Ireland than it is in the rest of the UK or the rest of Europe, and that's cystic fibrosis. Don't know if you know anybody that has cystic fibrosis, but it's a genetic disease. It's passed down through the family, and a sufferer of cystic fibrosis isn't able to make all the enzymes that you or I could make, and it means that they actually produce a lot of sticky mucus, and the biggest area where that's a problem is in their lungs. In their lungs, if you get a lot of that mucus, that's an excellent breeding ground for bacteria. And so quite often someone with cystic fibrosis will develop lung infections. But there are lots of other symptoms that affect them as well. The good news is that an awful lot of research has been done, and there's a lot of it being done over in Northern Ireland because this is a problem over here. In the 1920s, if a baby was found to have cystic fibrosis, they didn't expect it to live more than a few months. Whereas nowadays, the average life expectancy for someone with cystic fibrosis is over 40 years old. So there's definitely better treatment out there, better medication. Someone who's a sufferer would have to have quite a lot of physiotherapy, and sometimes that's done by their parents when they're young, by their partner when they get older, but certainly it's a different lifestyle than your lifestyle or my lifestyle. So we know now that it's inherited, and it's due to a recessive allele. Now, whenever we learnt about dominant alleles and recessive alleles, we learnt that a recessive allele is only expressed if there's two of them. In other words, if say it was an A, two small A's. If someone had a big A and a small A, that's the normal allele. That person wouldn't have cystic fibrosis, but this person would. So the normal allele is dominant. So in this case, we're using the letter A. Now, you might look up a different textbook and they might use a different letter. It doesn't matter. So big A represents the normal allele, which is obviously dominant, and little a represents the cystic fibrosis allele, which is recessive. Now, so let's think about the possibilities that you could have. So the genotype, that is what alleles you have. So there are three possible genotypes: two big A's, big A and a small a, and two small A's. So we said that the big A was normal. And this person here is also going to be normal. And two small A's, that's the only genotype that will give us cystic fibrosis. Now, you can fill that in. Now, on your booklet, I've put some extra information there. So this one here, we've called homozygous. So if you think back to an earlier lesson, homo means both the same. So homozygous, these are different. So they're heterozygous. At the bottom, again, both the same. So homozygous. And because big A is dominant, we write homozygous dominant. I obviously just going to squeeze it in there. And at the bottom, two small A's. The small A's are recessive, so we call that homozygous recessive. The one in the middle has one dominant and one recessive, but the fact that it is called heterozygous, hetero means they're different, so it can only be big A and small a. this individual here, this genotype here, someone with that genotype is called a carrier. If you look up the definition of a carrier in just ordinary English, it's basically something or someone who carries something from one place to another. In this case, in genetics, a carrier is someone who doesn't have the disease, so this person is normal, but they could pass on the small a to a child, and there is a possibility that child could have cystic fibrosis. Let's work out how that would be. Well, let's just look at a few facts here. 1/4 of the people in the UK carry the allele. So in your form class, possibly one, maybe even two people might be carriers. They might be big A, small a. If a baby is born with cystic fibrosis, that means they've got two small a's. They've got one from their mother and one from their father. So if someone was a carrier, they could pass that on. That person there is not going to pass on a little a. Whoops, I'm not sure what I did there. That person there could pass on a little a, and their child therefore could be little a, little a. So it'll be a carrier and another carrier. So here we've got some information. 2 carriers marry and are expecting their first child. What's the probability that it will have cystic fibrosis? So we're going to do the cross here, so we know that this person is a carrier, and this person over here is also a carrier. So we know they're big A, small a, big A, small a. What you can do now is just pause the video and work out what goes in the Punnett square and work out what is the probability. Probability is, it's a fraction. What is the probability that the child will inherit cystic fibrosis? So pause the video now. Okay, so the answers in here, 2 big A's. In here, big A, small a, big A, small a, or if you wrote small a, big A, that's fine. And 2 small a's. Out of the 4 combinations, is any one of them going to have cystic fibrosis? Well, this one here is going to have cystic fibrosis. And you're asked to circle that. Now, what is the probability that the first child will inherit cystic fibrosis? Well, the first child could have any of those outcomes. There's 4 possible outcomes. One of them has cystic fibrosis, so that's a 1/4 chance. That's the probability. All right, so there's 1/4 chance that they'll have cystic fibrosis. If they said so the first child had cystic fibrosis, what's the chance of their second child having cystic fibrosis if they get pregnant again? What about the chance of this second child having cystic fibrosis? Well, each time they reproduce, the sperm cells, the egg cells are made. It doesn't matter what happened the last time. So if you're asking about the second child or the third child or the 4th child or the 5th child, if you're just looking at that individual child, it's always going to be a 1/4. Okay, we're not asking what's the probability of getting 2 in a row or 3 in a row or 4 in a row. That would be a different calculation. If the question says, what is the probability of this second or this third or whatever child, it's the answer that we've got in this Punnett square, which is a 1/4. Now, it is possible in being a carrier, well, these are both carriers. This person here, well, all these 3 are not going to have cystic fibrosis. These 2 are carriers. So that's a 1/2 chance of being a carrier. And a 1/4 chance of being big A, homozygous dominant. To work out the chances of you having a child with cystic fibrosis if you know whether you're a carrier or not. So we've just said if both parents are carriers, the child has a 1 in 4 chance of being born with cystic fibrosis. All right. Looking back there, okay. And that's just what we've gone through there. A 2 in 4, that's really a half of being a carrier, and a 1/4 chance of neither having cystic fibrosis gene nor being a carrier. In other words, big A, big A. Let's look at this question here. Well, it's not so much a question, but it is a pedigree, which you looked at earlier. Pedigree, but it's family tree really, where as you can see there, the squares are male. Well, we came across that. Normally there'd be a little key beside it. So the squares are male and the circles are female. I'm not able to get a circle here, so I'll just... So male. And if they're coloured in, person has cystic fibrosis. In this example, individuals 3 and 4 in the middle line are half coloured in. So sometimes they'll do that to show that they are heterozygous. They've got one normal allele and one for cystic fibrosis. But let's look at what we can tell from this diagram here, just to have a look here. So if you think back, up at the top here, okay, these people here, that was the first generation, and then their children, and the second generation and third generation would be the original one's grandchildren. Okay, so 1 and 2, this is their grandchildren here. 3 and 4, they share the same grandchildren because this daughter married this son. So what can we tell just from looking at it? First thing you do if you get a pedigree is, well, we know we're talking about cystic fibrosis here. We know that cystic fibrosis, to have cystic fibrosis, you have to have two small a's. So we know that they must be little a, little a, little a, little a. We don't know what anybody else's is, but we can work some of it out. We know that their parents, 3 and 4 here, although they looked normal, so they had a big A, they must also have had a little a to pass on. And the same over here, they look normal or they don't have the condition, but yet because their son, number 4, has the condition and their daughter, number 6, has the condition, each of them must have a little a. If we look at the grandparents, so in the first generation, each of them has a big A because they don't have the condition, but we know that there must be a little a somewhere up here because it got passed down to this individual, and the same over here. Got a little a here, so there must be, it could be there or it could be there. We don't know. So we don't know for sure, but we can work out some information. So when you look at a pedigree, cystic fibrosis, you can work out some of the information. If we look at individual 5 in the third or the last generation there, we can't be certain what her genotype is. We know that she doesn't have the condition, so she has a capital A, but we don't know what the other one is. We don't know whether she got that big A there and that big A, which would make her big A, or that big A and a small a, or that small a and a big A. We just don't know. So we don't know what her second allele is. But certainly we can work out some things. In the exam question, they might give you something like that, and they might just, well, they would number the individuals consecutively. They wouldn't have 2 or 3 number ones, and they would basically ask you, what is the genotype of this person, or what is this person's genotype? They're not going to ask you to fill in everything, just a few things there. How do you know if someone has cystic fibrosis? Well, newborn babies are tested. Not all of them, but a third of them are tested. Very, very simple and quick blood test where they just prick their heel and take a sample of their blood. Someone with cystic fibrosis also produces more salty sweat than you or I would produce, And so that can also be done as a test. But if there was a history of cystic fibrosis in your family, so maybe your uncle had cystic fibrosis, or your aunt, or maybe your brother or your sister, you might possibly be a carrier. It depends on how closely related you are to the person, but there is a chance in some cases that you could be a carrier. How do you know? Well, basically your doctor would they take a swab. It's like putting a bit like the COVID test, but they put it into your mouth, and they can take some samples. They'll get some skins, they'll get some cells, get the DNA, and they can examine your genes to see if you have the cystic fibrosis gene. It was located in 1989, and so now they have all the expertise just to take a sample from you, and within hours they can have tested to see whether or not you're a carrier or not. So we've got that rubbing the side of the cheek with a brush, but like a cotton bud, or just taking some saliva. So it's pretty straightforward. Why would you want that test done? Well, as we said, because if you found out that you were a carrier, there may be a chance that you could pass on this allele for cystic fibrosis. If your partner was found not to be a carrier, in other words, he or she was big A, is there any chance that your children will have the condition? Well, if we do the cross, no. So if only one parent is a carrier, then there's no chance of their children having cystic fibrosis. But we know that if both parents are carriers, then they have to make a decision. They've got a bit of a dilemma. And that's really what's asking you at the bottom of page 11. Because we know that you can work it out that there's a quarter of a chance that their child will have cystic fibrosis. Now, I know a family, they have 2 girls, and both girls have cystic fibrosis. So it's not the fact that, okay, half the children are going to have it, or a quarter of the children are going to have it. Each time they have a child, there is a chance that the child could have cystic fibrosis. And sometimes you're asked, what dilemma would this couple face? And some couples will decide, well, I'd rather not have a child if it's going to have cystic fibrosis. And they might think of adoption or something else. Or they might just decide not to have children. On the other hand, other people might think, well, no, willing to take the chance. And if the child has cystic fibrosis, well, we'll care for it, we'll love it, it'll be fine. So the question isn't asking what would you do, but it's saying, what dilemma or what decision do these parents have to make? And it's basically whether or not to have children. And that's what you need to write at the bottom of page 11. So on page 12, there is a pedigree, a cystic fibrosis pedigree. It's a little simpler than the one I've just shown you, but you have to work out the same kind of things. Now, sometimes you might be asked, what is the genotype of person 1 or 2 or 3? And, sometimes it's quite easy to work out. Other times it's more difficult. So take your time, look back, look at their children, look at their parents if you've got that information. Make sure if it asks you for genotype, that you're writing these kind of answers, because you're writing about the alleles. If you're asked for the phenotype, it's the outward characteristics. So in this case, it's whether they have cystic fibrosis or not. If you're asked to draw a diagram to show how the possible offspring, show the possible offspring that they might have, by diagram, it means a Punnett square. Okay, make sure you do put lines in it. Don't just write letters. Okay, so make sure you've got your lines. Really, you should be drawing around there, but an examiner's not going to take marks off you, but you must have your alleles here. Now I'm just going to make these up. So it must be nice and clear. Doesn't matter which way round those two go. Same thing. Read the information. If you're asked to circle something, make sure you do it. If you're asked for a ratio, it's a ratio, so it could be 3 normal to 1 cystic fibrosis. If it asks you for the probability, well then that's not a third. 3 plus 1 gives you 4, so that would be a quarter of it being cystic fibrosis. 3/4 being normal. You might ask, what percentage of children would you expect to have cystic fibrosis? Well, if it's a quarter, you've worked out that's 75%. Okay, so it'll only take you 5-6 minutes to answer the questions on page 12. Bye.